The supervisor's whistle cut through the din of the Metropolitan Exchange Building like a blade through silk. 23 girls in identical navy skirts and white blouses snapped to attention behind their switchboards, hands folded, eyes forward. Margaret O'Brien felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten as Mr. Cromwell's heavy footsteps approached her station. "Ladies, tonight we have distinguished visitors from the Public Service Commission," Cromwell announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. "They will be observing our operations to ensure we maintain the highest standards of efficiency and discretion." His pale eyes swept the room like searchlights. "Any girl found gossiping about client conversations or failing to maintain proper protocol will be dismissed immediately and blacklisted from all telephone companies in the city." Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her headset. The metal was cold against her skin, a reminder of the thin line between employment and destitution that every girl in this room walked daily. She had worked the night shift for 8 months now, long enough to know that Mr. Cromwell's threats were never idle. Just last week, Sally Henderson had been escorted out for allegedly eavesdropping on a banker's conversation. No one had seen her since. The commission members filed in like undertakers in their dark suits, notebooks in hand, faces set in expressions of stern judgment. Margaret recognized the type from her father's union meetings, men who measured worth in productivity and saw workers as interchangeable parts in a great machine. She forced herself to look down at her switchboard, focusing on the familiar pattern of holes and cords that had become her lifeline in a city that chewed up Irish girls from Queens and spat out their bones. "Miss O'Brien," Cromwell's voice made her start. He stood directly behind her chair, close enough that she could smell his pomade and tobacco. "Your numbers have been adequate lately. See that they remain so tonight." The word adequate stung worse than outright criticism. Margaret knew her numbers were among the best on the floor. She connected calls faster than anyone except perhaps Dorothy Chen, the quiet Chinese girl who worked with mechanical precision 3 stations down. But Margaret's real skill was one she dared never reveal. She could hear things in the wires that others missed, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, conversations that didn't match any logged connections. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. As the evening wore on, the normal rhythm of the night shift established itself. Margaret's fingers moved across the board with practiced efficiency. Jack into hole, confirmation of connection, polite disconnection, when conversations ended. The commissioners wandered the floor like vultures, occasionally stopping to observe a particular operator, scribbling notes that would determine fates by morning. It was past 11 when Margaret first heard the anomalous voice that night. She had just disconnected Mr. Patterson from his broker when a faint conversation bled through the line. 2 men discussing something about shipments from the docks. Nothing unusual in that, except the connection showed completely dead on her board. She glanced around quickly, but the commissioners were at the far end of the floor, and Cromwell was in his glass office. Margaret pressed the earpiece closer and listened. The voices were clear now, one with a slight Brooklyn accent, the other with the cultured tones of Manhattan's upper class. They were talking about cargo manifests and payment schedules, their words crackling with the kind of nervous energy that suggested illegal business. "The Irish girl on the night shift," the cultured voice said suddenly, and Margaret's blood turned to ice water. "She's been listening longer than the others. Someone needs to have a conversation with her." Her hand jerked away from the switchboard as if the metal had burned her. This was impossible. There was no connection logged, no call in progress. The line showed dead, empty, silent. Yet she had heard her own description as clearly as if the man had been standing beside her. "Miss O'Brien!" Cromwell's sharp voice made her jump so violently that she nearly knocked over her water glass. "Is there a problem with your equipment?" "No, sir." She managed her throat dry. "Just a crossed wire. It's cleared now." He studied her face with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze, knowing that any sign of nervousness would mark her for special attention. Behind him, one of the commissioners had noticed the exchange and was walking over with unhurried steps. "This young lady seems distressed," the commissioner observed, his voice carrying the flat authority of bureaucracy. "Perhaps the evening shift is too strenuous for her constitution." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never worked a physical job in his life. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I'm perfectly fine, sir." The equipment occasionally picks up crossed signals from other exchanges. It's a known technical issue. It was a careful lie, one that used enough technical truth to sound plausible while concealing the impossible reality of what she had actually heard. Margaret had learned early in life that men like these respected confident explanations more than anxious apologies, even from young women they fundamentally dismissed. "Crossed signals," the commissioner repeated, making a note. "And how frequently do these technical issues occur?" The question was a trap, and Margaret knew it. Report too few incidents and she would seem to be lying about this one. Report too many and she would appear incompetent, or worse, deliberately listening to conversations she shouldn't hear. She thought quickly, drawing on her knowledge of the older girl's conversations. "Perhaps once every few weeks, sir. Usually late at night when atmospheric conditions affect the long-distance lines. It's mentioned in the technical manual, section 47, subsection 12. She had no idea if such a section existed, but the specificity of her answer seemed to satisfy the commissioner. He made another note and moved on to interrogate Dorothy Chen about her connection speeds. Margaret exhaled slowly, her heart still racing from the close encounter. The rest of the shift passed without incident, or rather, without any incidents she dared acknowledge. Twice more she heard fragments of impossible conversations, voices discussing things that made her skin crawl, mentions of girls who had asked too many questions, references to places in the city where people disappeared. Each time her board showed no active connections. Each time she pretended to hear nothing at all. Dawn was breaking over the Manhattan skyline when the night shift finally ended. The commissioners filed out with their notebooks full of observations, and Cromwell dismissed the operators with his usual lecture about discretion and efficiency. Margaret gathered her coat and handbag with deliberate calm, nodding goodbye to the other girls as if this had been just another ordinary night. But as she waited for the elevator, Dorothy Chen approached her with quick, nervous steps. The Chinese girl rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to herself with a caution that Margaret now understood better than she had 8 hours ago. "The voices in the wires," Dorothy whispered, her English careful and precise. "You hear them too, don't you?" Margaret's mouth went dry. She wanted to deny it, to protect herself with ignorance, but something in Dorothy's dark eyes stopped her. This girl knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew. "I don't know what you mean," Margaret said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. Dorothy glanced around the empty hallway, then leaned closer. "My grandmother in Chinatown, she says some people are born with ears that hear between the worlds. But she also says such people must be very careful who they trust." The elevator arrived with a mechanical clang, and Dorothy stepped inside without another word. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway, her mind reeling. Between the worlds, what did that mean? And if Dorothy had been hearing the impossible voices too, how many others were there? How many girls had learned to pretend deafness to keep their jobs and their lives? As she walked home through the gray morning light, Margaret's thoughts churned with new possibilities and new fears. The voices had mentioned her specifically, had known she was listening. That meant someone or something was aware of her ability, was perhaps even watching her. The commission's visit might not have been routine after all. She thought about Dorothy's grandmother and her talk of hearing between worlds. Margaret's own grandmother had died when she was 12, but she remembered the old woman's stories about the thin places where the living world touched others. She had dismissed them as superstition then, the comforting fantasies of a woman who had lived too long and seen too much. But now, walking through the empty streets of Queens as the city awakened around her, Margaret wondered if her grandmother might have known more than she had ever let on. The voices in the wires spoke of things that happened in shadows, of business conducted beyond the reach of law and conscience. They knew her name, knew her habits, knew she could hear them when others could not. The question that haunted her as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment was whether this strange ability was a gift or a curse, and more importantly, what price she would have to pay for possessing it. The summons to Mr. Cromwell's office came 3 days later, delivered by his secretary with the cold efficiency of a death warrant. Margaret sat across from his mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while he reviewed what appeared to be her employment file with theatrical deliberation. "Miss O'Brien," he began, not looking up from the papers. "The Commission's report was quite thorough. They noted several irregularities in your behavior during their observation." The word hung in the air like a noose. Margaret forced herself to breathe steadily, to project the calm confidence that had served her well during the inspection. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. I believed my performance that evening was satisfactory." "Satisfactory," Cromwell repeated, finally raising his pale eyes to meet hers. "The commissioners felt you seemed unusually nervous for a routine evening. They wondered if perhaps the pressures of the night shift were affecting your stability." It was masterfully done, Margaret realized. He was offering her an out. She could claim nervous exhaustion, accept a transfer to the less sensitive day shift, and retreat to safety. All she had to do was admit weakness, confirm their assumption that she was just another fragile girl overwhelmed by the demands of modern employment. "I can assure you, Mr. Cromwell, that my stability is quite intact," she replied evenly. "If the commissioners observed any nervousness, it was merely the natural result of working under such distinguished scrutiny." His smile was thin and predatory. "I see. Well then, we shall have to test that stability, won't we?" He opened a different folder, this one containing what looked like technical diagrams. "You claim to have extensive knowledge of our equipment's technical specifications. Section 47, subsection 12, I believe you mentioned to Commissioner Bradley." Margaret's stomach dropped. There was no such section. She had invented it in desperation, gambling that the commissioner wouldn't verify her claim immediately. Now Cromwell was calling her bluff with the patience of a spider that had felt a fly struggle in its web. "I may have misspoken about the exact reference number," she said carefully. "The technical manuals are quite extensive, and under pressure." "Indeed they are," Cromwell agreed, sliding a thick bound volume across the desk. "This is the complete technical manual for our switchboard system, all 347 pages. Since you're so familiar with it, I'm sure you won't mind demonstrating that familiarity." He stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the city below with the air of a man who held absolute power over the small lives in his domain. "I'm assigning you to a special project, Miss O'Brien. Each night this week, you will study one section of this manual and provide me with a detailed summary the following morning. Consider it professional development." The punishment was elegant in its cruelty. Margaret would have to spend her days studying technical specifications instead of sleeping, then work her regular night shift in a state of exhaustion. Any mistakes would provide perfect justification for her dismissal. Any sign that she couldn't handle the additional workload would confirm the commissioner's assessment of her stability. "I understand, sir," she said, lifting the heavy manual with both hands. "When would you like the first summary?" "Tomorrow morning, sharp at 8. Don't disappoint me, Miss O'Brien. The company has invested considerable resources in your training." Walking back to her station with the manual tucked under her arm, Margaret caught Dorothy Chen watching her with knowing eyes. The Chinese girl said nothing, but her slight nod conveyed both sympathy and warning. This was how the system worked. Step out of line, attract attention, and face consequences designed to break you down or drive you out. That night, the impossible voices returned with a vengeance. Margaret had barely settled into her rhythm when the first whispered conversation bled through a dead line. This time, she recognized one of the speakers, the cultured Manhattan accent from 3 nights ago, now discussing something about a warehouse fire in Brooklyn. "The investigation is getting too close," he was saying. "We need to eliminate some loose ends before they connect the dots." "What about the telephone girls?" The second voice was rougher, working class. Some of them might have heard things they shouldn't. Margaret's blood went cold as the cultured voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear fellow, who would believe the word of a switchboard operator against respected members of the business community? Besides, girls in that position tend to have accidents when they become inconvenient." The conversation continued, but Margaret forced herself to focus on her actual work, connecting real calls for real customers while the ghost voices discussed murder with casual indifference. She began to understand that what she was hearing wasn't random crossed wires or atmospheric interference. These were conversations happening somewhere in the city's shadows, somehow bleeding through into the telephone network where only a few people like her could detect them. Around midnight, she noticed something else strange. Every time she heard the impossible voices, the lights in the exchange building would flicker almost imperceptibly. Other girls attributed it to the old electrical system, but Margaret began to suspect it was connected to whatever force allowed these shadow conversations to reach her ears. During her break, she found Dorothy Chen in the small kitchen, carefully eating a rice ball wrapped in newspaper. The Chinese girl looked up as Margaret entered, her expression cautious but not unfriendly. "The manual," Dorothy observed, nodding at the thick book Margaret still carried. "Cromwell's favorite punishment for girls who see too much." "How do you know that?" Margaret asked, taking a seat across from her. "Third girl this year," Dorothy replied quietly. "First was Helen McCarthy. Heard voices, got the manual treatment, lasted 2 weeks before she quit. Second was Sarah Goldman. Same thing, except she had a nervous breakdown during her 3rd night of no sleep." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. She remembered both girls, had wondered why they'd left so suddenly. Now she understood the pattern. Identify the ones who could hear the impossible voices, break them down with impossible demands, eliminate the threat to whatever secret these shadow conversations represented. "What happened to them after they left?" she asked. Dorothy's dark eyes were unreadable. "Helen moved back to Boston. Sarah—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah had an accident with a subway train. Very tragic. The papers said she was distraught about losing her job." The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. This wasn't just about employment. It was about survival. The voices in the wires represented something dangerous enough to kill for, and she had stumbled into the middle of it through no choice of her own. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret whispered. "Because you're stronger than the others," Dorothy replied, wrapping up the remains of her meal with precise movements. "And because my grandmother says the darkness grows stronger when people face it alone." She stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. "The technical manual has some interesting sections if you know where to look. Page 212, subsection about emergency protocols. Read it carefully." That suggestion proved prophetic when Margaret finally made it home at dawn and cracked open the dreaded manual. Most of it was exactly what she'd expected. Dry technical specifications about voltage requirements and connection procedures. But page 212 contained something different. A detailed protocol for handling anomalous signal detection that read like it had been written by someone who understood exactly what she was experiencing. According to the manual, certain atmospheric conditions could cause cross-dimensional signal bleed that would be audible only to operators with enhanced sensitivity to electromagnetic variance. The protocol recommended documenting such incidents in a special log that was to be submitted directly to a specific department head. Not Cromwell, but someone named Frederick Walsh in Special Operations. Margaret read the section 3 times, her heart racing with possibilities. If this was official company policy, then her ability wasn't a curse or a delusion. It was a recognized phenomenon with established procedures. But why hadn't anyone told her about it? Why had Helen and Sarah been punished instead of transferred to this special operations department? As she prepared her summary for Cromwell, Margaret made a careful decision. She would include everything from the manual except page 212. That section would remain her secret until she could figure out what game was really being played and who she could trust with the knowledge. The next morning, she delivered her summary with the same quiet confidence she'd shown during the commission inspection. Cromwell reviewed it with obvious disappointment. She had done exactly what he'd asked, thoroughly and competently, giving him no grounds for criticism. "Very thorough, Miss O'Brien," he said finally. "Perhaps you do have the stability for this position after all." But his pale eyes held a cold calculation that told her this was far from over. He would find another way to test her, another pressure point to exploit. The question was whether she could learn enough about the shadow voices and their connection to the company before he succeeded in breaking her down. That night, armed with her new knowledge from the technical manual, Margaret listened to the impossible conversations with fresh understanding. She wasn't going crazy, and she wasn't alone. Somewhere in the city, other people knew about the voices in the wires. The question was whether they were friends or enemies, and whether she could find them before they found her. Margaret's opportunity came during the lunch break on Friday, when Cromwell left the building for his weekly meeting with the district supervisors. She had memorized the layout of the Metropolitan Exchange's upper floors from studying the emergency evacuation diagrams, and she knew that Special Operations occupied a small suite of offices on the 7th floor, 2 levels above the main switchboard operation. The elevator operator, a tired-looking man named Murphy, barely glanced at her forged delivery slip as she asked for the 7th floor. Margaret had practiced the lie during her morning commute. She was delivering technical reports to Mr. Walsh's office on behalf of the night shift supervisor. The manila envelope in her hands contained nothing more than blank paper, but it served as perfect camouflage for her real purpose. The 7th floor hallway was eerily quiet compared to the constant bustle of the switchboard operation below. Thick carpeting muffled her footsteps as she walked past doors marked with cryptic departmental designations: Signal Analysis, Network Security, Special Projects Division. At the end of the corridor, a frosted glass door bore the simple inscription F. Walsh, Special Operations Director. Margaret knocked twice and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. When no answer came, she tried the handle and found it unlocked. The office beyond was smaller than she had expected, dominated by a massive desk covered with what appeared to be electrical diagrams and city maps marked with red ink. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces bearing warning labels about classified materials. She had perhaps 10 minutes before Murphy would wonder why she hadn't returned to the elevator. Moving quickly but carefully, Margaret examined the papers on Walsh's desk. The electrical diagrams showed the telephone network's infrastructure, but with additional markings that didn't appear on any standard company materials. Certain exchanges were circled in red with handwritten notes about sensitivity thresholds and dimensional resonance points. One map of Manhattan caught her attention immediately. It showed the locations of every major telephone exchange in the city, but also marked several other sites with cryptic symbols. A warehouse in Brooklyn, a mansion on the Upper East Side, what appeared to be a church in the Bowery. Lines connected these locations to the telephone exchanges, creating a web of connections that suggested some kind of coordinated network. Margaret photographed the most important documents with a small camera she had borrowed from her brother's journalism supplies, working with the efficient speed of someone who understood that discovery would mean more than just losing her job. The filing cabinets were locked, but one drawer had been left slightly ajar. revealing folders labeled with dates going back several years. The folder marked with the current year's date contained personnel files, and Margaret's blood went cold as she recognized the names. Helen McCarthy, Sarah Goldman, and half a dozen other girls who had left the company under mysterious circumstances. Each file contained detailed psychological evaluations and something called sensitivity assessment reports that rated the subject's ability to detect what was euphemistically termed non-standard signal activity. Her own name appeared in the most recent report, dated just 3 days ago. According to the assessment, Margaret O'Brien showed exceptional sensitivity to dimensional bleed phenomena and was rated as a priority 1 asset for potential recruitment or elimination. The clinical language made her skin crawl. She was being evaluated like a piece of equipment, useful or dangerous depending on the observer's objectives. A photograph clipped to her file showed her walking to work, taken without her knowledge from across the street. Someone had been watching her, documenting her movements, building a case for whatever decision would determine her fate. The realization that her privacy had been violated so thoroughly filled her with a cold rage that burned away her fear. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent Margaret into motion, carefully replacing the files and moving toward the door with her fake delivery envelope held prominently. She opened the office door just as a tall man in an expensive suit rounded the corner, his pale gray eyes taking in her presence with sharp intelligence. "Miss O'Brien," he said, and his voice carried the cultured Manhattan accent she had heard in the impossible conversations. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Frederick Walsh." There was no point in pretending she belonged here. His tone made it clear that he knew exactly who she was and why she had come. Margaret lifted her chin and met his gaze with as much dignity as she could manage. "Mr. Walsh, I was looking for you, actually. Were you indeed?" He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne and something else, the metallic smell of electrical equipment. "And what pressing business brings a night shift operator to my private office during working hours?" "I've been experiencing some technical difficulties," she replied, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "Crossed signals, phantom conversations. I found a reference to your department in the technical manual and thought you might be able to explain what's happening." Walsh's smile was thin and calculating, like a chess player who had just seen his opponent walk into a carefully prepared trap. "Ah, yes, the technical manual. Section 212, I believe. You're quite the thorough student, Miss O'Brien." He moved past her into his office, settling behind his desk with the easy confidence of a man in complete control of the situation. Margaret remained standing, unsure whether she was being invited to confess or being given an opportunity to prove her usefulness. "The phenomenon you've been experiencing," Walsh continued, opening a different file folder, "is quite rare. Perhaps 1 person in 10,000 has the sensitivity to detect what we call dimensional signal bleed, conversations and communications that originate from, shall we say, parallel channels of reality." The casual way he discussed something so impossible made Margaret's head spin. Parallel channels. "Think of it as radio frequencies," he explained, pulling out a technical diagram. "Most people can only hear signals broadcast on standard wavelengths. But a few individuals, through some quirk of neurological structure, can detect transmissions from frequencies that exist adjacent to our normal reality." Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of deception or madness, but found only the calm assurance of someone discussing established scientific fact. "And these adjacent realities contain people who know about our world." "More than know about it," Walsh replied. "They actively monitor it. Some are benign observers, others have more interventionist inclinations. The conversations you've been hearing represent communications between entities who have learned to manipulate our telephone network as a surveillance and coordination tool." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The shadow voices weren't just discussing crimes in her reality. They were planning them, coordinating them from some impossible vantage point that allowed them to observe and influence events across dimensions. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Walsh leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of an entomologist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Because, Miss O'Brien, you have a choice to make. The standard protocol for individuals with your sensitivity is containment. We provide them with comfortable employment in isolated positions where their abilities can be monitored but not exploited by hostile forces. And the alternative? Active recruitment," he replied. "Join Special Operations as a dimensional communications specialist. Help us monitor and counter the activities of entities who would use their knowledge of parallel realities to harm people in our world." Margaret thought about Helen McCarthy and Sarah Goldman, about the clinical assessments in her file, about the photograph taken without her knowledge. What happened to the other girls who showed this sensitivity? "Helen chose containment and now works in our Albany facility, monitoring long-distance lines under controlled conditions," Walsh said smoothly. Unfortunately, Sarah attempted to share her experiences with a newspaper reporter. She had to be dealt with more definitively. The euphemism sent ice through Margaret's veins. "You killed her." "I protected the operational security of an organization dedicated to defending this reality from forces you can barely comprehend," Walsh replied without a trace of remorse. "Sarah's death was regrettable but necessary. The question now is whether you'll make a similar mistake or demonstrate the wisdom to accept one of the alternatives I've offered." Margaret realized she was trapped in a conversation that would determine not just her future but her survival. Walsh wasn't offering her a choice. He was presenting her with different forms of imprisonment, some more comfortable than others. But the information she had gleaned from his files suggested there might be a third option he hadn't mentioned. "If I joined Special Operations," she said carefully, "what would my duties involve?" "Monitoring dimensional communications for intelligence about hostile activities," Walsh explained. "Identifying other individuals with sensitivity like yours. Occasionally serving as a communications relay when we need to send messages through the dimensional channels ourselves." The last part caught her attention. If the company could send messages through the impossible network, that meant the communication flowed both ways. And if it flowed both ways, there might be opportunities for someone with her abilities to send unauthorized messages, to warn potential victims, to disrupt hostile plans, to turn the surveillance network against its operators. "I accept," she said, extending her hand toward Walsh. "When do I start?" His handshake was firm and cold, like grasping a piece of metal that had been stored in winter air. "Immediately. Report to me tomorrow night instead of to your regular station. And Miss O'Brien, I trust I don't need to explain the consequences of discussing this arrangement with anyone outside the department." Walking back to the elevator, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settling around her like a heavy cloak. She had bought herself time and access to information, but at the cost of becoming part of the system that had killed Sarah Goldman and imprisoned Helen McCarthy. The question now was whether she could learn enough about the dimensional communications network to find a way to use it against Walsh and his organization. Before they decided she had outlived her usefulness. That night, working her last shift at the regular switchboard, Margaret listened to the impossible voices with new understanding. They weren't random transmissions from parallel realities. They were part of a coordinated intelligence network spanning multiple dimensions, and she was about to become both its observer and its unwilling servant. But knowledge, she reflected as she prepared to enter Walsh's shadow world, could be a weapon in the right hands. And she was determined to make sure her hands were the right ones. Margaret's first night in Special Operations began with a ritual she hadn't expected. Walsh led her to a basement room beneath the Metropolitan Exchange Building, where banks of specialized equipment hummed with electrical energy that made her teeth ache. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and strange harmonics seemed to whisper at the edges of hearing. "Before you can work with dimensional communications," Walsh explained, adjusting dials on a complex console, You must be properly attuned to the network frequencies. This process will enhance your natural sensitivity, but also create a permanent neurological connection to our monitoring systems. Margaret studied the device he was preparing, a headset that looked like a more elaborate version of her switchboard equipment, but with additional wires and crystalline components that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. What exactly does permanent connection mean? It means that once you're attuned, you'll be able to hear dimensional communications without technological assistance, Walsh replied. It also means that we'll be able to monitor your brain activity remotely, ensuring that you don't attempt to misuse your enhanced abilities. The threat was delivered with clinical precision, but Margaret had expected no less. She had spent the previous day researching everything she could find about electromagnetic effects on human neurology, and she understood that Walsh was preparing to turn her brain into a biological antenna, one that he could tune or shut down at will. "I understand," she said, settling into the chair and allowing him to position the device on her head. "How long does the process take?" "Approximately 30 minutes for the initial attunement," Walsh replied, activating the machine. "During that time, you may experience disorientation as your consciousness adjusts to perceiving multiple dimensional layers simultaneously." The first sensation was like having ice water poured directly into her brain. Margaret gasped as the familiar world around her suddenly expanded, layers of reality peeling back to reveal vast networks of connection she had never imagined. The impossible voices that had whispered through dead telephone lines were suddenly clear as normal conversation, dozens of them speaking in overlapping streams of communication. She could see the speakers now, not physically, but as points of awareness distributed across what appeared to be multiple versions of New York City. Some versions were darker, their skies choked with industrial smoke and their streets patrolled by uniformed figures. Others gleamed with technologies that belonged in science fiction magazines, their inhabitants moving through cities of glass and metal that defied architectural logic. "Fascinating," Walsh observed, monitoring her responses on various instruments. "Your sensitivity rating is even higher than our initial assessments suggested. You're perceiving at least 7 distinct dimensional layers simultaneously." Margaret tried to speak but found her voice caught between realities. In one layer, she was sitting in Walsh's basement laboratory. In another, she was standing in what appeared to be the same room but filled with different equipment and different people. A third version showed the space as it might have been decades ago when the building was first constructed. "The disorientation will pass," Walsh continued. "Your brain is learning to filter and categorize the information streams. Focus on the voices. They contain intelligence about activities across multiple realities that could affect our world." Gradually, Margaret learned to separate the different layers of perception, to tune in and out of various dimensional frequencies like adjusting a radio dial. The voices became clearer, their conversations revealing a complex web of coordination between entities who seemed to exist primarily to monitor and manipulate events across parallel versions of reality. "The Brooklyn operation is proceeding on schedule," one voice reported, speaking from what appeared to be a reality where the warehouse district was controlled by armed militias. 3 more shipments arrived last night and the local authorities have been neutralized." "Excellent," replied a familiar cultured accent, the same voice Margaret had heard discussing her elimination weeks ago. "What about the Manhattan facility? Any problems with the new girl?" Margaret's blood went cold as she realized they were discussing her in real time, while she listened. "The attunement process is proceeding normally," Walsh's voice replied, and Margaret understood with horrible clarity that he was actively communicating with the dimensional network while monitoring her initiation. She should be fully operational within the week. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Walsh wasn't just monitoring communications from hostile entities. He was one of them, coordinating activities between his version of reality and others. The Special Operations Department wasn't defending against dimensional interference, it was facilitating it. Margaret forced herself to remain still, to give no sign that she understood what she was hearing. Through the enhanced perception granted by the attunement device, she could sense Walsh's attention focused on his instruments rather than her reactions. This might be her only opportunity to learn the full scope of the conspiracy before he realized how much she could perceive. Phase 3 implementation begins next month, the cultured voice continued. We'll need at least 6 more sensitives to manage the expanded communication requirements. How many candidates do you currently have under evaluation? 12 girls showing preliminary sensitivity, Walsh replied. We should be able to harvest at least half of them successfully. The others will require standard disposal protocols. Margaret bit her tongue to prevent herself from reacting to the casual discussion of murder. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the network's true structure. Dozens of facilities across multiple realities, all coordinating to implement some vast plan that required the systematic identification and exploitation of people like her. What about the resistance activities in the Bowery sector? Another voice asked, this one carrying a slight accent that might have been German. The local operatives report unusual interference with their surveillance equipment. We're aware of the situation, Walsh replied. There appears to be an organized group attempting to shield sensitive individuals from detection. We're implementing countermeasures. The mention of organized resistance sent a thrill of hope through Margaret's enhanced consciousness. If there were people actively working against Walsh's network, people who could shield sensitives from detection, then she might not be as trapped as she had believed. The Church of St. Bartholomew continues to be problematic, the German-accented voice continued. Their priest appears to have developed some form of dimensional shielding technology. Recommend immediate termination. Agreed, Walsh replied. Schedule the accident for next week. Make it look like a gas leak explosion. Margaret's enhanced perception allowed her to trace the conversation's origins to their sources across multiple realities, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The network wasn't just monitoring events. It was actively coordinating assassinations, industrial accidents, and other tragedies designed to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their operations. The attunement process is nearly complete, Walsh announced, beginning to power down the machinery. In a moment, you'll return to normal consciousness but retain the enhanced sensitivity permanently. Remember, Miss O'Brien, that everything you experience in this facility is classified at the highest levels of national security. As her awareness of the multiple dimensional layers began to fade, Margaret made a desperate decision. Using the last moments of her enhanced perception, she reached out through the network with all the mental force she could muster, broadcasting a single urgent message to any sensitives who might be listening. Church of St. Bartholomew, Bowery. They're planning to kill the priest, gas leak explosion next week. The effort left her mentally exhausted, but she had managed to send the warning before Walsh's machinery could establish its permanent monitoring connection to her brain. Whether anyone had received the message, she couldn't tell, but she had done what she could. How do you feel? Walsh asked as the machine powered down and the crystalline components stopped pulsing. Different, Margaret replied honestly. I can still hear the voices, but they're clearer now. More organized. Excellent. That indicates successful integration with the network protocols. Walsh removed the headset and made notes on her chart. Tomorrow night, you'll begin your regular duties as a dimensional communications monitor. Report any unusual activity immediately. Margaret nodded agreement while her mind raced with possibilities. The permanent enhancement would make it harder to hide her thoughts from Walsh's monitoring systems, but it also gave her unprecedented access to the dimensional network's communications. If she could learn to use that access carefully, she might be able to gather evidence of the conspiracy and find a way to contact the resistance group operating from the Church of St. Bartholomew. Walking home through the pre-dawn darkness, Margaret tested her new abilities cautiously. The voices were indeed clearer now, and she could sense the vast scope of the network's activities across multiple versions of New York. But she could also detect something else. Faint signals that seemed to be encrypted or shielded in ways that made them difficult for the main network to intercept. Someone was using the same dimensional communication channels to coordinate resistance activities. The question was whether she could make contact with them before Walsh's monitoring systems detected her attempts at unauthorized communication. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Margaret caught a fragment of conversation that made her heart race with desperate hope. "New girl at the Metropolitan Exchange has been compromised," a woman's voice reported through the dimensional static. But her warning about the priest got through. Someone's fighting back from inside their operation. The resistance knew about her. They were watching, waiting, perhaps even planning a rescue. Margaret fell asleep that morning with her mind buzzing with new possibilities and the first real hope she had felt since stumbling into Walsh's shadow world. But she also knew that her time was running out. Walsh's monitoring systems would soon detect any unauthorized use of her enhanced abilities, and when that happened, she would face the same fate as Sarah Goldman. The question was whether the resistance could reach her before Walsh decided she had outlived her usefulness. The explosion at the Church of St. Bartholomew never happened. Margaret learned this 3 days later when she detected Walsh's furious communications with his dimensional contacts, their carefully planned assassination disrupted by what he termed premature intelligence leakage. Her warning had gotten through and someone had acted on it fast enough to prevent the priest's murder. "We have a security breach in the Manhattan facility," Walsh reported during what he thought was a private communication session. Margaret sat at her new monitoring station pretending to catalog routine dimensional chatter while actually eavesdropping on her supervisor's increasingly agitated conversations. The St. Bartholomew operation was compromised before implementation. Someone with network access is feeding information to the resistance. "Run a full neurological audit on all enhanced personnel," came the reply from the cultured voice that Margaret had learned belonged to someone called the Coordinator. "Any unauthorized transmissions will show up as anomalous brainwave patterns during deep scan procedures." Margaret's blood went cold. A neurological audit would reveal her warning transmission immediately, and Walsh would have all the justification he needed to implement what he euphemistically called disposal protocols. She had perhaps hours before the scanning equipment arrived from whatever dimensional facility supplied such technology. That evening, as she prepared to leave the building after her shift, Margaret found Dorothy Chen waiting by the employee entrance. The Chinese girl's presence seemed casual enough. Many workers gathered here to wait for buses or streetcars, but her eyes held a message of urgent importance. "My grandmother would like to meet you," Dorothy said quietly as they walked toward the bus stop together. "She says the spirits in the wires have been very active lately and she thinks you might need guidance from someone who understands their language." The invitation was clearly more than it appeared to be, especially given the timing. Margaret glanced around carefully, noting the absence of the usual surveillance personnel who had been shadowing her since joining Special Operations. Either they had been called away for the neurological audit preparations or someone had found a way to neutralize their observation. "I'd be honored to meet your grandmother," Margaret replied, following Dorothy onto a bus headed toward Chinatown instead of her usual route to Queens. The journey took them through neighborhoods that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through her enhanced perception, Margaret could see layers of the city's past and future overlapping the present. Immigrant communities from different eras occupying the same streets. Technologies from various timelines coexisting in impossible combinations. The effect was disorienting but also oddly comforting, as if she was finally seeing the city's true nature instead of just its surface appearance. Dorothy's grandmother lived above a shop that sold herbs and mysterious substances in glass jars, its windows covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. The old woman who answered their knock was tiny but radiated an authority that reminded Margaret of her own grandmother's presence during thunderstorms. calm certainty in the face of forces that could destroy lesser souls. "You are the girl who hears between the worlds," she said in accented but precise English, studying Margaret with eyes that seemed far older than her wrinkled face. "My granddaughter tells me you have been caught in the web of those who would use such gifts for evil purposes." Margaret found herself nodding, though she hadn't consciously decided to confirm Dorothy's assessment. There was something about the old woman's presence that made deception seem both impossible and unnecessary. "They have changed your mind with their machines," the grandmother continued, gesturing for Margaret to sit on a cushion beside a low table covered with what appeared to be technical drawings mixed with traditional Chinese symbols. "But machines cannot touch the soul. They can monitor your thoughts, but not your spirit's true intentions." "Can you help me?" Margaret asked, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "They're planning to scan my brain tomorrow. When they do, they'll discover that I warned the priest about the planned explosion." "The priest is safe," the old woman replied with satisfaction. "Father McKenna has powerful protections around his church now. But you are still in great danger, and through you, many others who share your gift." She spread the drawings across the table, and Margaret realized they showed the same dimensional network maps she had seen in Walsh's office, but marked with additional information that suggested a completely different interpretation of the system's purpose. "What you call dimensional communication is very old magic," the grandmother explained. "For thousands of years, certain people have been able to hear voices from the spaces between worlds. Usually these voices bring wisdom or warnings from ancestors who watch over the living. But in recent decades, something else has learned to use these channels." Margaret studied the maps more carefully, noting symbols that indicated not just communication nodes, but what appeared to be dimensional breach points. Places where entities from other realities could potentially cross into this world. "Walsh and his organization aren't just monitoring other dimensions," she realized with growing horror. "They're preparing to let something through. Many somethings," the old woman corrected grimly. "Entities that exist only to consume and destroy, seeking worlds they can devour before moving on to the next. They have already destroyed multiple versions of our reality in other dimensions. Now they prepare to add our world to their collection." The scope of the threat was almost too large to comprehend. Margaret had thought she was dealing with a criminal conspiracy, but the reality was far worse. An invasion from beyond reality itself, facilitated by human collaborators who had been promised survival in exchange for their cooperation. "But there is hope," Dorothy's grandmother continued, pulling out a different set of drawings. "Others with your gift have learned to shield their thoughts from the machines, to communicate through channels the invaders cannot monitor. We call ourselves the Underground Church, though we welcome people of all faiths who oppose this evil." The new drawings showed a network of safe houses and communication points throughout the city, connected by what appeared to be a completely separate dimensional channel that ran parallel to the one Walsh's organization controlled. Churches, temples, synagogues, and other religious sites formed the backbone of this resistance network, their spiritual energy somehow providing natural shielding against the invaders' surveillance technology. "Father McKenna leads our operations in Manhattan," the old woman explained. "He has developed ways to use sacred spaces as anchor points for protective dimensional barriers. If you can reach his church, he can shield you from the neurological scanning and teach you to use your abilities against the invasion." Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with desperate urgency. "How do I get there without Walsh's people following me?" "The same way Dorothy has been traveling to visit me," the old woman replied with a slight smile. "Through the spaces between spaces where their machines cannot follow." She handed Margaret a small pendant made of what appeared to be crystallized metal, its surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow like living text. "This will allow you to step partially out of normal reality, to move through the city while remaining invisible to their surveillance. But it requires great mental discipline. Lose focus for even a moment and you will become lost between dimensions." Dorothy took Margaret's hand, her touch surprisingly warm in the cool apartment. "I'll guide you the first time. My grandmother taught me to walk the shadow paths when I was 12 years old. It's how I've been avoiding their attempts to capture me for enhancement." Margaret realized that Dorothy had been living with the same abilities and the same dangers for years, somehow managing to work in the telephone exchange while avoiding Walsh's attention. The knowledge that survival was possible, that others had found ways to resist, filled her with determination. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Now," the old woman replied, standing with fluid grace despite her apparent age. "The scanning equipment arrives tomorrow morning. By then, you must be beyond their reach and learning to fight back." As they prepared to leave through what the grandmother called the shadow paths, Margaret caught a fragment of dimensional communication that made her blood run cold. Walsh was speaking to the coordinator, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The O'Brien girl will be terminated tonight," he was saying. "I'm not waiting for the neurological audit. Her behavior patterns suggest active resistance, and we can't afford any more intelligence leaks." Margaret grabbed Dorothy's arm. "They're coming for me tonight. Walsh isn't waiting for the brain scan." Dorothy's grandmother moved to the window and peered out at the street below. 3 vehicles, government plates. They are already here." She turned back to them with calm urgency. "The shadow path it is then. Hold tight to each other and to your sense of self. The spaces between worlds can be challenging for those not accustomed to their geography." Margaret clutched the crystal pendant in Dorothy's hand. As the old woman began chanting in what sounded like a mixture of Chinese and Latin, the apartment around them started to fade, becoming translucent as another version of reality bled through. Through the overlapping dimensions, Margaret could see Walsh himself climbing the stairs with several armed men, their faces set in expressions of cold professionalism. "Step forward," Dorothy whispered, pulling Margaret toward what appeared to be a wall but felt like empty air. "Don't look back and don't let go of my hand." The church is only 6 blocks away through the shadow paths, but those blocks exist in 17 different dimensions. As they stepped through the dissolving wall and into the space between worlds, Margaret heard Walsh's furious shout echoing across multiple realities. "Find her! She cannot be allowed to reach the church." But they were already gone, walking through a version of New York where the buildings breathed like living things and the streets ran with silver light. Behind them, Margaret could hear the sound of splintering wood as Walsh's men broke down the apartment door, but the sounds grew fainter with each step deeper into the shadow realm. The underground church was calling, and Margaret was finally answering. Father McKenna was nothing like Margaret had expected. Instead of the frail, elderly priest she had imagined, she found a man in his 30s with calloused hands and eyes that held the steady calm of someone who had looked into impossible darkness and chosen to fight it. His church occupied a space that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its Gothic architecture serving as anchor points for barriers that kept Walsh's surveillance technology at bay. "Miss O'Brien," he said, greeting her in the sanctuary where stained glass windows showed scenes that shifted between biblical imagery and what appeared to be battles against entities that defied earthly description. "Dorothy's grandmother sent word that you've been compromised. We don't have much time before they trace your dimensional signature to this location." Margaret sank into a wooden pew, exhaustion from the journey through the shadow paths mixing with the overwhelming relief of finding sanctuary. "How many others are there? People with abilities like mine who've escaped Walsh's network?" 47 confirmed sensitives currently under our protection," Father McKenna replied, settling beside her with the easy manner of someone accustomed to counseling people in crisis. "Another 130 individuals with lesser abilities who help maintain our communication networks and safe houses. We've been building this resistance for 8 years, ever since we first discovered what Walsh's organization was really preparing for." Through her enhanced perception, Margaret could sense the church's protective barriers. Layers of spiritual energy that seemed to function like dimensional static. jamming the frequencies that Walsh's technology used to monitor sensitive individuals. It was ingenious, using humanity's oldest defense against supernatural threats to counter invasion from parallel realities. "What exactly are they preparing for?" she asked. The old woman mentioned entities that consume entire worlds, but I still don't understand how Walsh's network facilitates that. Father McKenna stood and walked to a map of Manhattan that covered most of one wall, its surface marked with symbols that indicated both Walsh's facilities and the Resistance's safe houses. The entities exist primarily in dimensions where physical matter is more flexible than in our reality. They can't cross over directly because our universe's physical laws are too rigid for them to maintain coherence. He pointed to several locations marked in red, all major telephone exchanges and communication hubs throughout the city. But they can influence our reality indirectly by coordinating human collaborators who weaken the dimensional barriers at specific points. Walsh's network has been systematically identifying these weak points and installing equipment that creates what amount to doorways between worlds. Margaret studied the map with growing horror. The pattern was clear once explained: a carefully planned network of breach points that would allow the entities to enter simultaneously at dozens of locations throughout the city. How many people would die if they succeed? All of them, Father McKenna replied with quiet certainty. These entities don't just kill, they absorb the life force of entire realities, leaving behind empty shells of dead matter. We've observed the aftermath in parallel dimensions where they've already succeeded. The worlds they've consumed are uninhabitable by any definition. The scope of the threat made Margaret feel simultaneously insignificant and uniquely important. Her ability to hear dimensional communications had accidentally revealed a conspiracy that threatened the existence of everyone she had ever known or loved. The weight of that knowledge was almost crushing. "What can we do to stop them?" she asked. "Until now, very little," Father McKenna admitted. "We've been limited to defensive measures, shielding sensitives from recruitment, disrupting individual operations like the planned assassination at my church. But your escape from Walsh's facility has given us something we've never had before." He pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be technical schematics mixed with religious texts. "You were successfully enhanced with their neurological attunement technology before escaping. That means you have direct access to their primary communication network, but protected by our dimensional shielding." Margaret began to understand the implications. "I could send false information through their network, disrupt their coordination. More than that," Father McKenna said, his eyes lighting with something that might have been divine inspiration. "Tomorrow night is the new moon, the optimal time for their dimensional breach attempt according to our intelligence. They'll be conducting final coordination communications across all realities simultaneously." He opened the folder to reveal detailed diagrams of the dimensional communication network's structure. "If someone with your enhanced abilities could access their primary coordination channel during that window and introduce what we call a feedback loop, essentially turning their own network against itself, the resulting dimensional cascade would destroy their ability to coordinate the invasion indefinitely." Margaret studied the technical specifications, her enhanced perception allowing her to understand the complex interactions between different reality layers. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use Walsh's own technology to create a resonance pattern that would shatter the communication links between dimensions, leaving the entities unable to coordinate their breach attempts. "What's the catch?" she asked, because there was always a catch with plans that seemed too good to be true. "The feedback loop requires someone to maintain it manually from inside their primary facility," Father McKenna replied quietly. "The person operating the system during the cascade would be at ground zero of a dimensional implosion. Survival is unlikely." The silence stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss. Margaret thought about her small apartment in Queens, her job at the telephone exchange, her simple dreams of someday marrying a good man and raising children in a better neighborhood. All of it would be meaningless if Walsh's masters succeeded in their invasion. "How do I get back into their facility?" she asked. Father McKenna smiled with the expression of someone who had hoped for exactly that response. "We've been working on a plan for that. Dorothy volunteered to be captured during a staged resistance operation. Once she's in their custody, she'll create a distraction that allows you to infiltrate the building through their dimensional communication systems." The plan was audacious and terrifying, requiring precise timing and perfect execution. Margaret would have to return to the Metropolitan Exchange Building, access the Special Operations Facility, and operate Walsh's own equipment against him while Dorothy risked her life to provide cover. "When do we begin?" Margaret asked. "Now," Father McKenna replied, checking his watch. "Dorothy is already in position. The staged capture happens in 30 minutes, which gives us just enough time to teach you the feedback loop procedure." The next few hours passed in a blur of technical training and spiritual preparation. Margaret learned to manipulate the dimensional communication equipment with the precision of a surgeon, while Father McKenna explained the religious significance of what she was attempting, a modern version of humanity's eternal struggle against forces that sought to destroy rather than create. As dawn approached, Margaret found herself back in the basement of the Metropolitan Exchange Building. Having infiltrated through dimensional pathways that bypassed all physical security, Dorothy's capture had proceeded exactly as planned, drawing Walsh and his security team to the upper floors while Margaret accessed the Special Operations Facility undetected. The equipment hummed around her with malevolent energy, its crystalline components pulsing in rhythm with communications from dozens of parallel realities. Through her enhanced perception, Margaret could sense the entities gathering at breach points across multiple dimensions, preparing for their coordinated invasion. She activated the feedback loop procedure with steady hands, watching as the dimensional communication network began to resonate with increasingly unstable energy patterns. Across the city, Walsh's breach points would be experiencing catastrophic system failures as the resonance cascade built toward its climax. "You're too late!" Walsh's voice cut through the electrical noise as he appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "The invasion begins in minutes. Even if you destroy our coordination systems, enough entities will break through to consume this reality." Margaret continued working, fine-tuning the feedback loop as the equipment around her began to vibrate with dimensional stress. "Maybe, but they'll have to do it without your help, and without the ability to coordinate their efforts. That gives humanity a fighting chance." Walsh raised a pistol, his hand shaking with fury. "I was promised survival, a place in their new order. You're destroying my only hope of living through what's coming." "You never had a place in their new order," Margaret replied, making final adjustments to the resonance pattern. "They promised you survival because they needed human collaborators. Once the invasion succeeded, you would have been consumed like everyone else." The realization that he had been betrayed by his own masters hit Walsh like a physical blow. His face went pale as he understood that his cooperation had bought him nothing but delayed execution. In that moment of comprehension, Margaret saw him not as a monster, but as a man who had made terrible choices out of fear and desperation. "It's not too late," she said gently. "Help me complete the feedback loop. Give humanity the chance to fight back that you almost took away." Walsh stared at her for a long moment, the pistol wavering in his grip. Then, with a sound that might have been a sob, he holstered the weapon and moved to assist her at the control console. Together, they fine-tuned the resonance cascade that would shatter the dimensional invasion network. The explosion, when it came, was not physical but metaphysical, a wave of disrupted dimensional energy that swept across parallel realities like a tide, severing the connections that had allowed the entities to coordinate their assault. Margaret felt her consciousness expand across multiple dimensions simultaneously as the feedback loop reached critical resonance. She saw the entity's confusion as their communication networks collapsed, saw their breach attempts failing as the carefully prepared doorways between worlds slammed shut, saw parallel versions of herself and Walsh working together in facilities across dozens of realities to complete the dimensional cascade. When the resonance finally stabilized, Margaret found herself still alive, but permanently changed. Her enhanced perception now extended across multiple realities simultaneously, making her a living bridge between worlds. Walsh stood beside her, his face aged by the experience but free from the haunted desperation that had driven him to collaboration. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked around the facility, its equipment now silent and powerless, the crystalline components dark and cold. Through the building's windows, she could see the sun rising over a New York City that would never know how close it had come to complete annihilation. "Now we rebuild," she said. "The telephone network, the communication systems, the connections between people who want to help each other instead of consuming each other. And we prepare for the next time, because there will be a next time." In the weeks that followed, the world gradually returned to what passed for normal. The Metropolitan Exchange Building was quietly purchased by a private foundation and converted into a research facility dedicated to studying what the public reports described as atmospheric interference patterns in telecommunications equipment. Margaret became its director, using her unique abilities to monitor dimensional communications for signs of renewed threat. The old telephone switchboard system was replaced with new technology that incorporated safeguards against dimensional interference, and a new generation of operators was trained to recognize the signs of anomalous signal activity. Most of them never learned the true purpose of their training, but a few, those with the rare sensitivity to hear between worlds, were quietly recruited into the underground church's expanded network. Dorothy Chen became Margaret's assistant, her grandmother's wisdom helping to establish protocols that balanced technological innovation with spiritual protection. Father McKenna's church evolved into the headquarters of an international organization dedicated to monitoring and countering extra-dimensional threats. Its membership drawn from every religion and philosophy that recognized the fundamental importance of protecting life against forces of pure destruction. Walsh, stripped of his former authority but granted clemency in exchange for his cooperation, worked as a technical consultant, his knowledge of the entity's methods proving invaluable in developing new defensive systems. His collaboration during the final moments of the crisis had earned him a chance at redemption, though he would spend the rest of his life working to atone for his earlier choices. Margaret kept her small apartment in Queens, but her world had expanded to encompass multiple realities and countless possibilities. Sometimes, late at night when the dimensional barriers were thin, she could hear voices from parallel versions of herself, some who had failed to stop the invasion, others who had never faced the threat at all, a few who had found different solutions to the same fundamental problem. The voices no longer frightened her. They were reminders that every choice mattered, that individual courage could alter the fate of entire realities, and that even in the face of impossible odds, hope was never truly lost. In a city of millions, a single switchboard girl had heard the voices that others missed, and in doing so had saved them all. The network hummed with new purpose now, carrying messages of connection rather than conquest, binding communities together instead of preparing them for consumption. And in the spaces between the words, in the silence that existed between one conversation and the next, Margaret listened for the whispers that would warn of the next threat to emerge from the darkness between worlds. The switchboard girl had become the guardian of reality itself, and she was ready for whatever came next.